Welcome to Trust Talk. Trust isn't just about results, it's about the process. In this episode, we welcome Joel Brockner, professor at Columbia Business School and a leading expert in organizational behavior, to explore how decision-making can build or break trust. From corporate reorganizations and layoffs to leadership blind spots, Joel explains why procedural fairness matters and how mishandling tough decisions can have lasting consequences. Whether you're a leader navigating change or simply curious about the psychology of trust, this episode is packed with insights you won't want to miss. Your host, Severin DeWitt.
Joel, welcome to Trust Talk. Many people assume trust is just about results, whether a leader delivers on promises. But your research suggests that how decisions are made is just as important.
Thanks, Severin, and thanks very much for having me. It's just as important in two ways. One, if you just look at when people respond to a decision, there's how happy they are with the decision itself, and then there's the factors that go into how the decision was decided, which is often known as procedural fairness or process fairness. And it's been found that, if you look at as we call in research, the amount of variance explained, in other words, the strength of the importance of these two factors, they're on average about the same. Sometimes process is more important than outcome. Sometimes outcome is more important than process, but on average, they're about the same. That's one way to talk about it. But there's another way to talk about it, and that is the effects of process and outcome, they depend on one another. So, the old expression, it's not only what you do, it's how you do it. That's true. That's what I just said. But what we're also finding is that the effects of what you do depend on how you do it. And what I mean by that is, especially when you're being the bearer of bad news, then it makes a big difference how people respond in terms of their support for the decision maker, the organization. Very much depends upon the fairness of the process. More so than when the outcomes are favorable, for example.
Yeah, we will come to a couple of examples later on. Can you share at this stage an example from your research or a real-world case where procedural fairness built trust and another where its absence led to distrust?
Well, one of the really compelling examples has to do with how people respond or in terms of whether or not they're going to file a lawsuit. And this is true both in the workplace as well as in terms of whether doctors get sued. What's been found is that a major determinant of whether or not they get sued for a bad outcome. For example, if you've lost your job, not everybody sues for wrongful termination. A major determinant is whether at the time that you received the bad news, did you feel like you were treated in a respectful, trust-inducing kind of way, a fair way. For example, if people felt like they were treated disrespectfully, they were 17 times more likely to sue for wrongful termination compared to if they thought they were treated respectfully. And as I said, that's in the workplace. The same pattern shows up in terms of whether people, when they feel like they had a bad medical outcome, whether they will sue for malpractice. Also very much has to do with at the time that they were interacting with the medical professional, were they treated in a respectful, trust-inducing way, or just the opposite.
You have found that leaders often believe they are acting fairly, yet employees perceive things differently. What are the most common mistakes leaders make in trying to establish fairness?
There's a bunch of them. One is that they don't really check in. As you said, they assume, they often believe, but at the end of the day, it's not what you said, it's what people heard. Leaders feel like if they, for example, gave an explanation, that would stand on its own. What's also necessary to do is give an explanation and then follow up to see how it lands. And that's really a blind spot that many leaders have. I understand it because it's more work. It's not enough to just kind of go about things in the right way, but you also have to check in with people to make sure that what you were intending is experienced that way. And we as leaders often assume, I know I told them, but the question is, what did they hear? And until you get the evidence that they heard what you intended, very often there'll be a disconnect between what you said and what they heard.
Some of my earlier guests emphasized that transparency and consistency build trust. Yet some leaders unintentionally damage trust despite having good intentions. Why does this happen and how can they prevent it?
I would say two things. One is they think that outcomes carry the day. As long as I'm giving you what you want, Severin, then a leader might assume, well, you're going to be happy with what you got. And the blind spot is, again, as we going back to your first question, people's reactions to decisions don't simply depend upon what they got, they depend upon the way in which they got them. But managers seem to believe, again, short-sightedly, that as long as you give them what they want, they'll be happy. That's not always the case. The other reason, and it's kind of related to this, is that if you give people the outcome that they want, sometimes you do it in a way that they experience as demeaning. You know, the expression, you shouldn't bite the hand that feeds you. Or why would you bite the hand that feeds you? And one answer is because if the hand that feeds you, in other words, giving you good outcomes that you wanted, did so in a way that made you feel dependent on them or you lowered your self-esteem in the process of giving you the help, that oftentimes can lead to a disconnect between what managers intended and the way in which things land.
Trust and power are deeply linked. Leaders who hold power can either build or break trust depending on how they use it. Some argue that control mechanisms, if applied fairly, can actually increase trust rather than erode it. What's your perspective? Do you think trust and control can coexist?
Yes. And again, we're going back to it's the way in which you communicate your control. If you communicate the way in which you have power over others in a way that makes them feel less than, then that power can reduce trust. On the other hand, if you can do it in a way that downplays their dependency, for example, if you give them explanations going in, if you ask for their involvement in the process, then that's a way in which trust can actually enhance a sense of control because now people are more intrinsically interested. They feel engaged, and therefore they're more willing to go along with you. And in a funny kind of way, you've increased your control precisely because you used the soft touch rather than the hard touch.
One of your other findings is that an employee's past experience or personality influences how much they trust a decision-making process. Can you elaborate on this dynamic?
Yeah, so oftentimes when I talk to executives about how to handle a change process, how to handle a layoff or a change in policy, they want to know how to do it. And I have some advice on how to do it, but to a large extent, their perceptions of how you handle this process, the current situation, has a lot to do with how you've handled things in the past. So if you hear cynicism in response to a change process or the announcement of a change, it's a pretty good bet that people were unhappy with how things were handled, in the past. I'm agreeing with what you're saying, that their past experience does influence what their experiences of a current situation. Again, cynicism is there. You hear expressions like, oh, it's their flavor of the month, right? Which speaks to a cynical attitude on the part of recipients of some organizational decision. That pretty much tells you things were not handled well, either in terms of what was decided or the way in which was decided, or both. And so therefore they carry over those bad experiences from previous situations to their perception of the current situation.
Ian Shapiro, one of my guests, links institutional trust to economic stability. When people feel financially secure, they tend to trust more. Does jobs insecurity automatically lower trust in leadership, and how can leaders counteract this effect?
Well, I would agree that job insecurity tends to lower trust in leadership, right? But it's not automatic. I think what happens is that when people are feeling insecure or more generally uncertain, either uncertain about what's going to happen or uncertain about their standing as a member of the organization, what that happens is that they become very vigilant to how they're treated. And so on the conditions of greater uncertainty, and job insecurity would be just one example, what we know from lots of research, my friend and colleague Kees van den Bos at Utrecht University is at the top of the list. It's been shown that people are more affected by the fairness with which they are treated precisely on the conditions of uncertainty, including but not limited to job insecurity. So one way to counteract the effect is, back to your second part of the question, is especially when people are experiencing insecurity, you can ward off the possibility of low trust by, especially under those conditions, ensuring that you handled the process in a fair way. You explained why, you treated people with dignity and respect, you gave them voice, you made decisions based upon accurate information. A whole bunch of things go into this thing called process fairness, and it's particularly incumbent upon managers to exhibit that under conditions of insecurity.
Many organizations have had to navigate sudden disruptions, such as COVID-19 and rapid digital transformation, and more today's example, disruptions in trade relations. Based on your research, how should leaders approach trust building when uncertainty is high and decisions need to be made rather quickly?
When uncertainty is high, see earlier comment about the need to be fair. But to your second point about decisions need to be made quickly, then I think you need to exercise fairness in the most time-efficient ways. But one of the best ways to exercise fairness, we know, is to involve people in decision-making, give them voice, empower them, be participatory. These are all different ways of saying the same thing. So the good news is that they get people engaged. They feel like their views were considered, they had input and all that. The bad news is that it takes time. And sometimes when decisions need to be made quickly, by definition, you don't have the luxury of time. So what you want to do under those conditions is to find other ways. For example, I tell executives in programs that if you give a reasonable explanation about why you're making a decision, and you do so in a reasonable tone of voice, and you need both, good explanation delivered courteously, respectfully, is a time-efficient way to exhibit fairness and therefore engender trust.
Imagine a company undergoing a major restructuring. The leadership team insists they are making fair decisions and they do whatever you just advised, but employees still feel uninformed and fear favoritism. How should leaders communicate and act to restore, in that situation, the trust?
Well, again, Severin, this relates to a bunch of things we've already discussed, namely, oftentimes there's a disconnect between what leaders think they're doing and how it lands based upon previous experience. Again, they know in this situation they're being fair, but based upon the past, they weren't fair, either in terms of what they decided or how they decided it. And so you can imagine a leader saying, hey, but this time we're being fair, kind of put aside previous experience. And so my best suggestion in a situation like this is to have patience, to stay the course, to be not totally surprised when there's kind of a doubting response, especially if you've given them reason to be doubtful based upon how you've handled things in the past. They might be in a state of denial, but when you've kind of changed your ways. The best way to overcome that state of denial is to slow and steady wins the race. Continue exhibiting fairness, give room for people to be skeptical at first, but if you are patient, if you continue to exhibit fairness, then their skepticism is likely to break down. So stick with it.
Joel, have you seen any recent high-profile cases where procedural fairness, or the lack of it, played a key role in how employees, customers, or the public viewed an organization?
Well, I think we're seeing it right now in the United States. What's happened is that with the change of the presidency, President Trump has come in and has introduced lots of changes. And you can say what you want about the content of the change. There'll be different points of view, but the process of the change, the way in which things are being communicated are, shall we say, they didn't get the memo on the fact that procedural fairness matters, is what,
No.
what I would say.
Yeah.
So you have lots of sometimes conflicting messages being sent. You have a situation where lots of changes are being rolled out. We shouldn't be surprised in a sense, because when Elon Musk took over at Twitter, even use the same language. The words are a fork in the road. That's what Twitter employees were told. And essentially they were told in a rather rude manner that either you're with us or you're not with us. Now, again, some people aspire to that or, would think that that's a kind of a good way to go. I don't. And what's happening is that the workforce, the federal government workforce, is being whipsawed by, again, not simply what's being decided, but the way in which things are being decided. So more on this story as it develops, and unfortunately it seems to be developing every day in a kind of high volume way.
Workplaces are changing fast. Remote work, AI-driven decisions, and shifting expectations of fairness. Are traditional ideas of procedural fairness still relevant, or do leaders need to rethink how they build trust in this new environment?
Well, I think the ideas are still relevant. In other words, what I've been saying throughout, and the research quite supportive, is that the process really matters. How you handle things really matters. So that's still true, that traditional idea. Now, the question is, given some of these changes that you've talked about, remote work, AI, and so forth, how to convey that you've gone about things in the right way, in a fair way. So just one case in point is that in remote work, oftentimes the way in which you are treated is, how shall we say, less palpable. This idea of the disconnect between what managers are intending and what employees are receiving. I think that the possibility for disconnect goes up even more in remote work environments. So it's more challenging in the sense that managers have to, as I said earlier, not only have to be fair, but also have to be perceived as fair. And to validate that they've been perceived as fair, there's even more work to do to overcome the barrier that might be introduced by the remoteness.
With the rise of AI and automation, decision-making is increasingly being delegated to algorithms. Do you see this shift as a potential risk to procedural trust? What should leaders be aware of as these changes unfold?
Well, certainly people have beliefs about the rise of AI and automation. For example, there's a belief that with AI or automation, it invariably is going to mean that workers' job security is threatened. I think that's sometimes the case, but it's not always the case. Again, this importance of the way in which you handle it goes up. You have to demonstrate, knowing that if people are going to think a particular movement means bad things for them, you have to first of all clarify if and when that's true. It's not always true. And the other thing that I think AI and automation does is it has the risk of making decisions seem less transparent. Information was fed into a computer and somehow a decision came out of it. And so with that perception of reduced transparency, the onus is on managers to explain more why, to make things more clear, to try to demystify the process, and in so doing, enhance perceived fairness.
Joel, if we want to close up our interview, if you could give one key takeaway to leaders who want to ensure procedural fairness and trust in their organizations, what would it be?
Boiling things down to one point, again, has never been my long suit, but I'll give it my best shot, Severin. If I had to say only one thing, there's a perception oftentimes when it comes to handling the process well. You'll hear managers say, well, that would be very nice to do it in that way, but I don't have the time for that. I don't have time to explain. I don't have time to involve people. I don't have time to make things transparent. Sometimes I have to be a little bit brusque and quick in my decision making. Therefore, I'm coming across as rude and disrespectful. I don't have the time for it. That's one of the biggest barriers I've heard over the years. To which my response would be, well, consider what happens if you don't handle the process well. If you don't take the time now, you probably will not handle the process well. And in not handling the process well, you're going to make an even bigger mess for yourself. And now you're going to have to do even more work later. You hear the expression, pay me now or pay me later. In other words, be fair in the process now or be fair in the process later. I would build on the importance of doing it fair in the first place with the expression, the ounce of prevention, the pound of cure. By taking the small amount of time, relatively small amount of time to do things in a fair way, it counteracts the much bigger amount of time you're going to have to invest later on if you don't do things in a procedurally fair way, right? So it's not pay now or pay later, it's pay less now or pay a lot more later. And that might help managers kind of get over the hump of feeling like they don't have time to do things in the right way.
That's a good and fair way to concluding our interview. Joel, thank you very much for being our guest today.
Totally my pleasure, Severin. Yeah, no, thanks for having me, and look forward to future contacts with you.
All the best.
All the best.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Trust Talk. We hope today's conversation inspired new insights into the transformative power of trust. At Trust Talk, we're committed to exploring trust's role in shaping a better world, one story at a time. If our mission resonates with you, we invite you to support us. Your donation, no matter the size, helps us continue these meaningful conversations. Visit us at trusttalk.co/donate to contribute and be part of this journey. Thank you for listening and being part of the Trust Talk community. We can't wait to have you join us again for the next episode.